Hello, welcome. Welcome to the third and final debate of the New York Times Climate Hub. This is a tradition at the New York Times now of having debates with teams for and against a motion, which we'll be asking you to vote on at the end of the debate. So the motion today is democratic leaders are better prepared to address climate change than authoritarian ones. So suitably controversial, and we're excited to have an esteemed teams of debaters as well as judges here with us today. To moderate the debate, I'm delighted to welcome Somini Sengupta, international climate reporter for the New York Times, and Sophie Lambin, CEO and co-founder of Kite Insights. Take it away, Somini and Sophie.
Hello everyone. Welcome to the New York Times Climate Hub. My name is Somini Sengupta. I'm the international climate reporter for the New York Times. Very pleased to welcome you all to the final debate, which will be sizzling, I'm sure.
Thank you, Somini. And I'm Sophie Lambin from Kite Insights, and I'm the curator of the program, and I'm particularly excited about this final debate.
So today our debaters will be discussing whether democratic leaders are better prepared to address climate change than authoritarian ones. It comes at a time when my email inbox has been flooded with actually very recent reports, very recent research that finds that climate change is an existential challenge to democracies. And the report that just came out about a week ago also finds that this existential challenge of climate change could lead to more authoritarian rule if efforts to curb emissions fail.
Doubtless, this will be a very tough debate, passionate yet constructive, with argument on both sides that we hope will reveal new insights. I'm now going to help you understand the construct of this debate. To help answer that tough question, we'll be calling on two teams of debaters, three on each side. We have the for side and the against side. In pairs, they will be coming to make their case, each having up to 4 minutes, but no more than 4 minutes. We will hear from each pair 3 times, after which we will invite 3 judges that are sitting on the front row here to come back and provide some constructive comments. They're not really judges because the judging is ultimately up to you, the audience. But they will be there to provoke a final retort by each team to clench the winning argument, hopefully, and each team will have another 1.5 minutes to make that final comment. So, the final call is up to you, and we this time using a very sophisticated technology called applause, which means we're going to hear a lot of noise at the end of it all. So, time is really of the essence with this debate. I will remind debaters to look at the clock for your 4 minutes. We will be turning off the mics after 4 minutes. And I will now start to invite the first pair to come. So, audience, please support me in welcoming our debaters. They're brave. And on the for side, I would like to invite Dr. Michal Nachmani, founder and CEO of Climate Policy Radar. On the against side, I would like to invite Tasneem Essop, Executive Director, Climate Action Network International. Please join me in welcoming our first pair.
Ladies, gentlemen, anyone beyond those definitions, I would like you to think for a moment about the worst decisions that your own government has made about climate change. The delayed ones and the bad ones. And now close your eyes and imagine, you're not closing them, and imagine that you alone could reverse those decisions and make better ones. Maybe with a group of selected friends. Wouldn't that be fantastic? No opposition. You can do whatever you want. But here's what you won't have and what authoritarian governments don't have. You wouldn't have the rich and intricate ecosystem of ideas and inspiration and creativity that comes only when everyone is part, and that can only happen in democracies. Because democracy allows for the diversity of ideas and accountability that only the rule of law and civil liberties like free speech and free media can create. We're in this stunning hub at the New York Times where ideas are not only disseminated, but bad ideas are criticized and brought to light. The critical freedoms protected by democracy include the right to disagree and the right to protest. We've seen 100,000 people on the streets in Glasgow this weekend, and tens of millions in the streets around the world in the last few years. And those voices on the streets not only hold the people in the blue zone this week and their leaders around the world to account, and not only do they threaten their seats and their rule if they make the will of the people unheard, protesting does more than that. Protesting gives a sense of agency. And agency is the critical connection between rage and hope. And hope is the only thing that can get people to roll up their sleeves and do something about the climate crisis. We need hopeful people to build and sustain businesses with an explosion of ideas and experiments and innovation to drive the energy and agriculture and industry and transportation transition. And we think that authoritarianism is good for business, but that is a myth. Dr. Ruth Ben-Ghiat warns us that Putin has jailed over 100,000 business people on trumped-up charges of tax evasion and financial irregularities. Because when the rule of law is replaced by the whims of a dictatorship, then success depends on how close you are to the leader and not how good your business or idea is. And we need workers' unions that are, of course, much stronger in democracies to negotiate and navigate the just transition. As we wind down polluting industries, we will need to not leave behind workers and communities. And we need the people to build the future through our communities, through building this joint resilience that only communities and neighborhoods where everyone feels included can happen. And finally, we need to hold governments to account, even through the state's own institutions. Over 40 court cases have been brought by citizens around the world, winning in Pakistan, where a farmer brought his government to court for not providing sufficient policy to protect him against adverse policy effects, to the Netherlands, to hundreds of other court cases that are happening around the world. And we need people and agency because the climate crisis cannot be solved top-down. We tried top-down with the Kyoto Protocol. That failed. But the Paris Agreement, which is alive and kicking despite our criticism of it, is working due to the bottom-up nature of it into everybody's involvement and sovereignty. So with this, you can open your eyes, look at each other. We are the solution. We can only do it together, and we can only do it in an empowered democracy. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michal. So I'm glad you said that we should close our eyes and imagine. Because it is imagination to believe that we are living in a truly democratic world, and that across the board, the concept of Western democracies, in fact, materializes in the way you've described. The important issue about this debate and the topic we are debating is that in this day and age, binary and generalized posits about what is democratic and what is authoritarian do not work any longer. It is far more complicated than that, and there are a number of underlying assumptions in that posit that we're discussing today and nuances that we should not ignore. Now, the belief that democratic leaders, particularly from Western countries, are in fact democratic in their practice is something that we have witnessed through experience in the past 2 years, not necessarily the truth. We have witnessed in democratic, so-called, countries the rollback of human rights, the fact that their citizens who suffer because of climate change, their needs have not been addressed. Hurricane Katrina, for example, the victims of Hurricane Katrina today, their issues have not been resolved, and their problems and their suffering has not been resolved. So when democratic leaders are not able to take care of their citizens, and especially those most vulnerable, not only their citizens, but also citizens beyond their borders, that they are responsible for the suffering due to climate impacts that they drove and caused by their historical actions. That lack of compassion, that lack of responsibility, the lack of putting those millions of people who are suffering because of a climate crisis, their needs last, does not, in my opinion, talk to democratic leadership. So yes, we can protest. Yes, we can have our voices raised. Yes, we can put everything out in social media. Does that result in change? In a change of actions by these leaders? I can tell you a definitive no. Right now, in the halls of these negotiations, it is these Western democratic leaders, these leaders of rich nations, that are actually not allowing progress for agreements that will in fact address those suffering millions in the country. We are fighting a hard battle for them to just agree to provide the financial support to address losses and damages due to climate change, and especially for those in developing countries. Not agreeing, and the US particularly is the one that's always blocked this issue in these negotiations. These democratic leaders were willing to trade off human rights and indigenous rights out of the text as we sit here, and we have to fight for that as civil society. Are we going to win it? We'll have to see. So the notion that just because you're an elected democratic leader in a so-called democratic nation and you're allowed to express yourself, have freedom of speech, is democracy and is better, is highly questionable. We really have to interrogate that more, because it does not translate into actions. And with all due respect, rich nations have so much more to do, and they have not taken responsibility for their actions.
Thank you. That was a strong start, Somini.
Very strong start. I'm taking notes. I'm going to introduce to you the second pair of debaters. They will each have 4 minutes to make their case. And the for side will begin again. So, arguing for the motion, Chris Stark, who heads the Climate Change Committee for the UK government. He's a Glaswegian. And perhaps relevant to our debate, he is, his Climate Change Committee advises and monitors and acts as a watchdog to the government. Arguing against the motion, Catherine Priestley, founder and managing director of Parkvale Capital, and her firm invests in clean technology in both the UK and in China.
Take it away.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this great, great city. This is Glasgow. This is not a forest. This is the birthplace of some of the most important technological innovations in the fossil fuel age. James Watt's coal-powered steam engine drove an industrial revolution with ideas that he came up with just down the road from here in Glasgow University. We Glaswegians, because I am a Glaswegian, I was born here, I live here, can lay claim to some of the greatest of the early engineering and commerce that drove the astonishing increases in prosperity that we have seen in the West from coal and from steam. You know the next part of this story, ladies and gentlemen. you know that the carbon dioxide that was released from those machines, those technologies, has accumulated in our atmosphere. It has caused climate change. But let me tell you the other side of that story, a more interesting one perhaps. The industrial progress certainly did begin in this city, but it also was lost in this city too. Generations of Glaswegians suffered poverty, economic dislocation, as the end of that fossil-fueled industry age fell very quickly upon the factories and the shipyards of this city. And now we host COP26. This is Glasgow's next chapter. This is the most important global climate summit there has ever been, and that's what I want to talk about, because as we turn decisively away from fossil fuels, as the science says we must, unequivocally, we need democracy. It's democracy that can shape a path to carbon neutrality that carries public support. It's democracy that gives a voice, gives agency to all sections of society in this transition. It's democracy that will shape the institutions we need to deliver it, like my own organisation here in the UK. Democracy is how we legitimise the societal shifts, the economic shifts, the incentives that we need to reach net zero as quickly as possible. Democracy provides the transparent processes to scrutinise the change that we are now committed to. It brings accountability. It gives citizens a voice on how we can achieve our climate goals. Glasgow's story is a metaphor, ladies and gentlemen. In Glasgow, the transition from heavy industry came about, as Hemingway memorably put it, in two ways: gradually and then suddenly. It was not a transition that Glasgow anticipated. It was painful for this city. The transition to net zero does not need to be like that. We know the change will soon be upon us. It's already here. It's already happening. There shouldn't be any surprises this time round. The rapid move away from fossil fuels, the new zero carbon industries, the decline of the old ones, we all face these challenges. We know what's coming. We can plan for it. But we need democracies to enable a fair transition this time. Now, the other side are going to argue that authoritarian states can plan better for the long term, but we in democratic states can do long term too. We can do that when we have the right legal framework. Here in the UK, we have that framework. We have our Climate Change Act. My organisation provides the evidence on the necessary steps that we need to take as a country, and we provide the independent appraisal of progress, scrutinising government. Democratic processes on climate can be very messy, but they work, and they deliver a stronger mandate for change. The crucial condition of success is to approach this transition bottom-up, not top-down. To plan for this transition with those who will be most affected, to give them a voice in determining the right path to carbon neutrality. Only democracy can bring that kind of agency to citizens. There's a phrase that you'll hear occasionally in this city and in these parts: nothing about us without us is for us. It's democracy that provides that kind of representation. That's how we'll make net zero stick. Thank you.
Who is better prepared? That's the question of this debate. We've had a long time to prepare. The IPCC published its first report 30 years ago in 1990. Before and since that time, climate scientists, mostly working in democratic states, have largely been ignored. Worse than ignored, they've suffered harassment, intimidation, and death threats for the work that they are doing. Two obvious case studies: the United States versus China, as proxies for democratic and authoritarian states' preparedness for climate change, the world's two largest polluting countries today. China adopted a proactive stance towards climate policy in 2008, around the time it became a net importer of energy. From this date, it began a massive investment in renewables, to the point that today, China is the leading producer of wind and solar power technologies and the leading consumer of wind and solar alternatives. In addition to this, approximately 70% of its energy demands are met from hydro, and they are continuing to massively invest in the liquid gases, hydrogen and liquid nitrogen, and of course, nuclear. They are doing this at an unprecedented pace to move away from the fossil fuel industry for their social security and also for their energy security. We know this from working in China on clean technology and how fast and rapidly they are deploying all new technology. We don't see this anywhere else in the world. Their authoritarian state allows for rapid, joined-up, system-level thinking. There is very little friction in the authoritarian state, and we know this can have good and bad consequences. But when time is of the essence, as is our climate emergency, this clarity of long-term policy and the speed of action and the investment and the scale of the Chinese markets is the difference between making it and not making it. It puts China in the position of being the global leader on transforming energy systems and climate change action. And that influence is rapidly translating abroad through their Belt and Road program, as we know. Contrast this with the world's largest democratic country, the second largest global polluter in the world, the United States. We are so often told democracy is messy. It is also just as corrupt. Elections every 4 and 5 years means there is no consistent leadership, no long-term policies on important issues like climate change. Large political funding by powerful lobbyists skew debates and decisions towards the powerful elite. It is not hard to figure out who is trying to undermine our climate scientists. Up to 12 months ago, the President of the United States was a climate denier who took the United States out of the Paris Agreement. Who knows if Trump will return in 2024? And today, President Biden is struggling to get his climate funding through Congress. So tragically, we know this has been politicized. Amongst the many questions we have to ask ourselves is, why do democratic governments still subsidize fossil fuel companies and fossil fuels to the tune of billions of dollars a year and a multiple of their collective investment in any clean technology? Why do they allow lobbying of the fossil fuel industry? And why do they still allow for the perpetuation of false and damaging narratives by anarchists and climate deniers all across Western social media with no regulation? Democracy doesn't work if you don't educate people. An inconvenient truth is that a socialist state with Chinese characteristics, or in the parlance of this debate, an authoritarian state, not a democratic one, is the champion of energy transformation and climate change action. Who is better prepared for climate change? It's obvious. The facts are all too clear.
Sorry, Catherine. I actually didn't know they were going to do that, but the rule is a rule. So, the tension is mounting, and so is the time for the final argument, which promises to be a sparkly one. Let me warn you. On the four sides, we have Robin Scott, co-founder and CEO of Apolitical. Robin is very well versed in the art of holding political leaders to account. And on the against side, we have Sandrine Dixson-Declève, co-president of Club of Rome, the first female co-president of the Club of Rome. And she is also known as being the most influential woman globally driving change for the green transition. Take it away.
There's a wonderful commencement speech by the writer David Foster Wallace, which begins with a story about two young fish swimming along together when they encounter an older fish swimming in the other direction. And the older fish says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on, and after a while, one turns to the other and says, "What the hell is water?" For many of us in this room today, watching online, democracy is that water. It's what Wallace calls a banal platitude with life and death consequences. It's a system we've come to take for granted, which we love to criticize for all its infuriating weaknesses, too often forgetting its unparalleled strengths. Strengths that are grounded in a golden principle of accountability. Strengths that give us societies where women, disproportionately affected by climate change, have an equal voice and an equal vote, where neither business leaders nor Greta need to fear if they criticize their governments. And where, just to get a bit meta on you, meta in the original sense of the word before Facebook tried to spoil it along with democracy, where we can stand on the soil under the trees of a democracy and freely debate an alternative form of government. Now, I'm not suggesting the other side want the nasties of authoritarianism. This is a debate about a Faustian bargain where we trade off some cherished values for the perceived benefits of authoritarianism in fighting climate change. But there is very good reason to believe that those benefits are just perceived, and that to sacrifice democracy at the altar of climate change would be an existential mistake. First of all, democracy is actually doing better. It's a low bar, I'll give you that, but it's better. There's some research looking at commitments to the Paris Agreement, and the difference between fully authoritarian and fully democratic regimes equates to about 1.6 degrees Celsius. Secondly, we can make democracy better. Now, I'm not getting all Ted Lasso on you and telling you just to believe. Democracies clearly can be corrupted by special interests. We've heard about that. But so can authoritarian regimes. The answer then isn't to ditch democracy, to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The answer is to fight the perversions of democracy. With our votes and with our public service, it's to fight for democracy and for more democracy that listens not to special interests, but to the people. And there's never been a better moment to lean into democracy. We have a tailwind. Already, globally, 64% of people think that climate change is a global emergency. That figure is only going to grow, and it won't grow in a linear way. Just look at how quickly opinion swung on gay marriage. So to vote against this motion means not only are you forgoing the better system, it means you're striking something worse than a Faustian bargain, because your side isn't even guaranteed. There's no guarantee an authoritarian leader will think long-term and act long-term about climate change. The only guarantee is that if they break a commitment, you have no means of accountability. The evidence shows when you cast the dice of authoritarianism, you're more likely to get a Venezuela than a Singapore. Democracy gives us rights and votes and power. Never give those up. Thank you.
So I would like you, as we closed our eyes at the beginning of the session, to close your eyes again. And to remember that climate change is not an existential risk to democracy, but to humanity. What we are asking you now to do is to envisage what a true leader looks like. A leader that has authority. A leader that actually thinks through what is important for the collective good. A leader that is enlightened within that authority. That understands that a centralized system, that long-term planning, is what is needed to get out of this existential risk. We must depoliticize climate change, and we must depoliticize this risk. This is the crux of this debate. The urgency of action that is needed in the same way that we needed it during the pandemic demonstrates that we need authority. We need leadership, and that leader, whether she be a she or a he, has to demonstrate true leadership. Market-driven based solutions are insufficient and often linked to so-called democracies. Unregulated business activity that has hijacked our democracies.
Look at the United States. We have a Biden making declarations across the cup, and by the same token, we have a Congress that is saying no and holding hijacked the entire Congress by one man who lives in the pocket of the fossil energy industry. We can no longer argue that a democracy is truly democratic. We can no longer argue that the way in which we have structured our democratic processes are servicing people, planet, and prosperity. If we have a leader who understands her authority, which is to put in place a long-term system that protects people, planet, and prosperity, no matter whom comes in place after her, to alleviate poverty, to ensure that at the same time we have no social tipping points and no environmental tipping points. That is the leadership that we need. Let's not get caught up once again in false politicization of this debate. Democracies are increasingly attracting politicians who are unqualified, who are in the pockets of vested interests, who are driven simply by the position and the power rather than by public interest and public service. They serve a party, not society. For large developing countries, the indulgences of democracy's processes are a luxury. Small, richer countries can, in some cases, embody a democracy. But we must take into consideration that large-scale economies will need some level of long-term planning and authority. Thus, they need strong leaders who are able to act decisively and to take into consideration that democracies put too much emphasis and weight on individual liberties and freedoms and rights rather than the rights of the collective. Once again, climate change is the greatest humanitarian risk. And if we do not think about leadership that has authority to ensure that we emerge from emergency, then we will have lost our battle against climate change. Thank you.
Okay, 3 rounds of debates done. Can we please give it up for both sides for really intellectually engaging with the subject, which is tough, it's uncomfortable, and very real. So please, a round of applause for both sides. So, Sophie?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, I don't suspect that any of you will go to a dinner party having that kind of argument. So you clearly had to push it for the sake of the debate and of our entertainment. So thank you.
So we're going to hear from the debaters again. But now I want to invite our esteemed judges to comment on what they have heard without declaring a winner. That's up to you. But I really would invite the judges to engage with what you've heard, engage with what you would like to hear more of. What did the debaters miss? What did they elide? So, introducing judge number 1, Sir David King. He is the founder and chair of the Center for Climate Repair at Cambridge University.
Introducing judge number 2, Daphne Frias. She's a climate justice and disability activist, and she's also a member of the Generation Climate Initiative of the New York Times.
And our final judge, Paul Van Ziel, co-founder and Chief Creative Officer of The Conduit, based in London. Judges, you each have 3 minutes.
Climate change is quite simply the biggest challenge humanity has ever had to face up to. And the reason it is such a big challenge is because we are all involved and we all have to pull in the same direction. And what I want to ask each side of the debate is whether or not they would agree that they've been highly selective in choosing their examples. If I was arguing on one side of the debate, I would, as has happened, choose China as a very good example. I have been there many times, and I think China is doing more than the United States and has done more than the United States over the past 20 years. But what if we then instead chose Russia? So haven't we heard a lot of selective choosing between authoritarian and democratic states? That's the question I would put to both sides. Please tell me, could you stop being selective and decide how you could take a position against the other side based on the reality of how the climate change debate has gone? I think I hear, for example, if we look at democracies, we don't choose Australia and Brazil as good examples when we're talking about democracy. So I think each side is equally guilty of this. And my bottom line, and I come back to this being the biggest challenge humanity has ever had to face up to, and by the way, it's with us today. We're already very, very late in the day to manage this problem. What are we doing pointing a finger at each other? Shouldn't we all be pulling together? Shouldn't we, those of us who believe action is required, support every country that is taking the right action and criticize every country that is not, regardless of which side you're on? To me, that's the critical question that I want each side to answer. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Firstly, thank you, both sides, all debaters, for an incredibly engaging conversation and a lot of food for thought. One of my first questions and interventions is I didn't hear any side talk about young people and how young people fare in the climate crisis. And as the resident young judge on this esteemed group, I have to say that was incredibly disheartening. Because as we hear our leaders say, young people are the future, but I challenge that notion and say, young people are the right now. We are not waiting for our leaders to do something, or rather to not do anything. We are taking up the mantle and saying enough is enough. And I think about when we talk of authoritarian governments, does that leave any room for young people to have freedom of expression? Does that leave room for young people to actually run for elected office, as I have in my own district, and become the voices for their community, not only by striking and marching, but by actually being able to be part of legislative bodies that get to make a difference? I also challenge the forward side to think about the diversity of our democratic communities. And while that is amazing, there are so many people in that diverse community that don't feel heard and don't feel listened to. So how do we change our democratic processes to make sure that every single community can equitably and honestly be heard? For the against side, I would challenge them to say that actually, one of the debaters noted that social media can be harmful in creating false narratives around the climate crisis. But as a young person, I have seen how the power of Gen Z has transformed the use of social media to disseminate information to communities who probably wouldn't be able to learn about the climate crisis as effectively if it wasn't for the power of social media. We've also been able to hear from indigenous communities, from frontline communities who use the power of social media to break through the barriers of the noise around the climate crisis to share their stories. Also, I think a huge issue that happens is that in authoritarian governments, we see that young people are fighting for the bare minimum. They're fighting for freedom of expression. So how do we give them the agency to move beyond just the bare minimum of human rights to actually take up the mantle for the climate crisis? And I challenge both sides to think about how the conversations at COP have actually been going. When we talk about the transparency in these conversations, I am actually keen to believe there is no transparency in these conversations. Young people are not invited to these negotiations. Communities of color are not invited to these conversations. So I'd be keen to have both sides talk about how do they feel either government can challenge the insular nature of these conversations and actually have multiple communities be included in these conversations.
So I have 4 thoughts that I'd love the esteemed debaters to come back on. The first is time. It seems to me that when we're thinking about this, we have to think about the fact that we're out of time. And I'd like to ask you to respond more specifically. If we had 50 years to resolve this, what would your answer be? If we have 8 years to resolve this, what would your answer be? If we had 1 year to resolve this, what would your answer be? And if we need to resolve it next week, what would your answer be? And it seems to me that democracies are deeply inefficient and messy and Churchillian in the sense that they're the worst systems except all others. And authoritarian systems are better, arguably, when we have a small amount of time left to us. And I'd like you to think a little bit more and speak to a little bit more about the time question. The second is efficiency. Empirically, have we made the case that if you rack it up, and both sides gave some cherry-picked case studies to say which systems empirically across the 200 or so nations in the world are going to deal with this in the most efficient way? If you take China out of the conversation, does that change your answer? Thirdly, moral philosophy tells us that the hardest choices are not between good and bad, but often between good and good, between values that we cherish and that we have to trade off against each other. And I'd like to hear a little more about those trade-offs in a more coherent philosophical way. So if you have to flood a village in order to build flood walls on the outer side of the village in order to save an entire country from rising tides, and some people's lives are lost for a greater benefit, firstly, is that something that climate change is going to inflict upon us? And are we going to have to increasingly think about how we will make those decisions? And therefore, what forms of governments are able to make those moral trade-offs in the most careful and attentive way, recognizing that those moral trade-offs are coming? And finally, and I think you alluded to it beautifully, the rights of future generations. This really isn't about the polities in front of us and the citizens in front of us and the groups of people in this room today. They're about children and grandchildren, people ahead of us. And international law has begun to embrace this idea of the rights of future generations. And so the question is, which systems make the best decisions for the future and for future generations? And I'd love you to think about that a little bit more as well. Thank you.
Well, it's lucky that the debaters have 1.5 minutes to respond to that. They might have to take their pick. So what we're doing now, thank you, Judge, for those beautiful comments, very rich indeed. And we're now going to give the debaters a chance to reflect on those comments and prepare their final rebuttal. Whilst they do that, we're going to play a short video, so talk among yourselves, debaters, feel free to confer. And I'll see you in 2 minutes.
As a reporter, my job is to truth squad what I hear people say. And I just want to point out, as I think some of the judges alluded to, we heard a lot of presumptions from both sides, very well-argued presumptions, that authoritarian systems are better at planning for the future, or that elected leaders uphold democratic values. Those are presumptions. And I would love to hear, when both sides come back, evidence. What is the evidence that either authoritarian systems or democratic systems have been able to deliver on mitigation, on adaptation, on a just transition, all the things that we are talking about? So we'll leave it to the two teams to confer, and we'll be back.
If you can put a video, thank you.
We're reporters from the New York Times. No flights, no roads. We're trying to figure out what animals are being affected.
The Galapagos is a really challenging place to work. El Nino starting to go haywire. Everywhere is going to get touched by climate change.
Okay. For the final remarks, we're going to call both teams up to the podium. You will choose a representative to deliver your final rebuttal. Each team, you have 1.5 minutes. That's 1.5 minutes to make your final comments. We'll begin with the for team. Please come up.
I'm speaking, but we really speak as one voice, because in democracies, we all have a voice, and all our children will have a voice. I want to begin with a note of humility. It is not impossible that there's a world in which we embrace authoritarianism and the climate crisis is tackled at speed, even though the evidence to date doesn't show that authoritarian regimes are faster. You can see how it might. It's not impossible, but do you really think it's probable? And even in the highly unlikely event it did happen, do you really think it would happen without devastating collateral damage to human rights, without the trampled being more trampled? The Belt and Road Initiative has not been great for climate change or human rights, just to pick one example. In a world with democracies and autocracies, democracies are collaborative. You're still better off with them. I'll finish with one more thought experiment. Imagine with your vote on this motion, you have the power to decide whether every state turns democratic or every state turns authoritarian. You have no say over who the leaders are, just the system of governance. Which would you pick? We heard we need to talk about children. I have a 5-month-old who will grow up in a hotter and more chaotic world, and potentially a much hotter and much more chaotic world. For me, it is absolutely no contest. Thank you.
We call up the against team. Please deliver your rebuttal.
COP is a democratic process. We've had 26 of them so far. How are we doing? The young of the world are casting their vote every day out on the street in process. It is not working. We're already being selective about who's winning and who's losing. So what we're arguing for is the right type of authoritarianism. And let's remember the question in the debate, who is more prepared? So of course we're going to use China as an example, because China not only consumes the world's largest amounts of energy, but also through its Belt and Road program has tremendous influence on what is happening in South America and in Africa. So yes, it's really important what this key authoritarian state is doing. And a regime of authority is absolutely what we need right now as we face the world's greatest risks. We need decision-making, we need clarity, and we need long-term planning. Ladies and gentlemen, you must see you have no choice but to vote this motion down. And we urge everybody to use the important lessons that we can learn from the Chinese system. Thank you.
All right, I think this is the moment of truth, where we're going to be asking you, the audience, to vote. The judge, you're now allowed to take a side, which you were not before. So I'm going to ask people to clap clearly and loudly for the side they think was the most compelling in the way they put their argument. When I ask the first set of applause, just be aware that there will be a second one afterwards. So don't spare your applause in case the second one is really loud, if you see what I mean. So let me try to make this very clear for the for side and for the against side. If you think that the for side argument was really compelling, please clap now. Thank you. If you think the against side was really compelling in making its argument, applause now. What do you think, Somini?
Yeah, this is a difficult audience. Shall we try again? Should we try to?
Does it cost you to concede that the against team might have won?
I think it was quite close.
Okay, let's do it again then.
Actually, I think it was quite close. Let's do it again. Applause if you think the for side has made the most compelling arguments today. Oh man, the judges are clapping. Thank you. If you think the against side has made the most compelling argument.
All right.
Yeah, that was more clear.
Yes, I think the against side have it. Congratulations.
Congratulations, team.
Well, this is not quite finished because I think Somini will probably want to share a few final thoughts on that result.
Look, I think I love surprises, and I love the opportunity for all of us to think more deeply and to challenge our assumptions and to continue to look for the truth. And the only thing I will leave you with is that this question is a very high-stakes question, and it is not resolved. And we, as reporters, are here to do our jobs, to answer that question, and to challenge your assumptions, and to help you think more deeply about who and how to solve this profound human challenge. So thank you all, and thank you to our debaters, and thank you to our very thoughtful judges. Thank you.
Thank you.